For 2 years, I thought the absolute greatest danger to my boyfriend was a past-due rent notice. I spent my nights sliding bowls of cheap, instant ramen across a thrift store table to Leo, a struggling art student whose hands were always stained with charcoal. I worked double shifts at a greasy diner just to keep our heat on, fiercely protecting a boy I believed was simply too gentle for this brutal city. But right now, I'm staring at the polished barrels of heavily armed men, boxed in by 4 blacked-out SUVs in the dead of night. The men holding the weapons aren't aiming at me. They are bowing deeply, reverently, to the boy in the frayed sweater standing by my side. When Leo finally speaks to them, the shy, exhausted art student completely vanishes. The voice that commands these ghosts is absolute zero. It's the voice of an apex predator. I didn't know I was sharing a mattress with the underworld's most ruthless ghost. I didn't know the hands I held to keep warm were already soaked in invisible blood. I thought I was dating a broke college student. But tonight, I found out he's the heir to the dragon head, and the Syndicate just came to collect their king. The freezing wind whipping through the alleyway didn't chill me as much as the sudden, suffocating silence. As those heavily armed men remained bowed, their faces hidden in the deep shadows of the SUVs, Leo didn't flinch. He didn't reach for my hand to reassure me or whisper that it was all a mistake. The boy who supposedly couldn't afford winter boots stood with the absolute, terrifying stillness of a predator assessing its territory. Looking at the rigid, unfamiliar set of his jaw, the illusion of our 2 years together began to shatter, piece by fragile piece, spiraling backward in my mind to the exact moment the lie began. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a sprawling, unforgiving university lecture hall, a place where the air always smelled of stale coffee and exhausted ambition. I was a scholarship student, perpetually running on 4 hours of sleep between double shifts at a greasy downtown diner just to make rent. I sat in the back row, fiercely clutching a second-hand textbook I'd spent a week's grocery money on. That's when he walked in. Leo looked like the very definition of a starving artist. He wore an oversized, frayed wool sweater that had seen better decades, his fingers smudged with dark charcoal, his eyes carrying the heavy, distant look of someone burdened by the world but lacking the bus fare to escape it. When the professor sharply announced the exorbitant price of the required art history text, I watched Leo's shoulders slump. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet defeat that it pierced right through my own exhaustion. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone drowning in a city built only for the rich. Acting on a rare impulse of solidarity, I slid my battered textbook across the scratched wooden desk, bridging the gap between us. He turned, offering me a smile that felt so incredibly genuine, so painfully gentle, that it anchored me to him instantly. From that single shared book, an entire universe of shared poverty bloomed. We built a life out of scavenged moments and shared struggle. Our dates were long, winding walks through free public galleries, where we would critique priceless paintings with the arrogant, fearless confidence that only broke 20-somethings possess. We would split a single order of cheap diner fries, drawing elaborate dreams of a quiet, peaceful future on flimsy paper napkins. He told me a vague, melancholic story about his estranged family, a father who demanded he join a soul-crushing corporate machine, and his own desperate need to forge a simple, honest life away from overbearing expectations. I believed every single word. I held his hands, my thumbs tracing the hard calluses on his palms. I assumed those rough patches came from gripping heavy canvases and chiseling cheap stone. I never once considered that they were the kind of calluses forged by the textured grip of a heavy-caliber firearm or sparring in a Syndicate training ring. I was utterly wrapped up in the romance of our shared survival. But as I stood in the alleyway, surrounded by the Dragon Head's elite enforcers, the truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Leo hadn't been learning how to survive the streets with me. He was a prince playing a peasant, studying the intricate, desperate heartbeat of the city not to escape it, but to eventually rule it. The starving artist was simply the masterpiece he had painted just for me, and tonight, Under the glare of tactical headlights, the canvas was finally tearing apart. The illusion didn't shatter all at once. It fractured in agonizingly slow motion, like a microscopic flaw in a diamond finally giving way to immense pressure. It began on a bitterly cold Tuesday evening, precisely 2 weeks before that terrifying night in the alleyway. I had picked up an unscheduled closing shift at the diner, my feet aching fiercely as I trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to our drafty apartment. When I pushed the heavy door open, the scent of cheap pine cleaner and old radiators hit me. I found Leo asleep on our sagging, secondhand sofa, an open textbook resting precariously on his chest. As I gently reached down to pull the frayed wool blanket over his broad shoulders, his sleeve rode up, revealing a heavy, metallic gleam clamped securely to his left wrist. It was a watch. But even with my severely limited knowledge of luxury goods, I instantly recognized the impossible, breathtaking craftsmanship. It was a masterpiece of horology, featuring a flawless, sweeping second hand, a subtle, almost dangerous shimmer to the dark sapphire face, and a titanium band that caught the dim apartment light. It was a timepiece that cost significantly more than the entire dilapidated building we lived in, perhaps more than my entire expected lifetime earnings. When I cautiously asked him about it the next morning, carefully masking my anxiety with a casual tone, his reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly smooth. He laughed a light, perfectly self-deprecating sound, and claimed he'd found a brilliant, unauthorized knockoff at a sketchy flea market downtown. To prove his point, he carelessly unclasped the heavy metal and tossed it onto our chipped Formica counter. I bought the lie in the moment, but the cold, heavy reality of that metal lingered darkly in my mind. Then came the violent, undeniable incident at the diner. A belligerent, highly intoxicated customer, incredibly angry over a misunderstood order, aggressively cornered me near the swinging doors of the kitchen. His massive, rough hands grabbed forcefully at my apron, violently pulling me forward. Before I could even scream for the manager, Leo materialized out of nowhere. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a wild, desperate punch like a normal boyfriend might. He simply placed one terrifyingly steady hand on the drunk man's shoulder, his fingers digging surgically into a specific pressure point, and leaned in. He whispered something directly into the man's ear. I couldn't hear the exact words over the ambient clatter of the diner, but I witnessed the immediate, visceral reaction. The drunk man turned completely pale, all the blood violently draining from his face, as if he'd just looked into an open grave. He nodded frantically, backed away quickly with his hands raised in absolute surrender, and practically sprinted out into the freezing rain. Looking back, I began to notice the small, terrifying anomalies. I noticed how the aggressive neighborhood corner boys, usually loud and territorial, went dead silent and actively averted their eyes when Leo walked past. I noticed how our notoriously vicious slumlord gave Leo a wide, nervous berth and never once asked for our late rent. He wasn't just surviving our city, he was quietly commanding it. The absolute truth finally tore through the fragile canvas of our shared life during that freezing walk home through the industrial district. We had deliberately taken a shortcut to avoid the biting wind, moving quickly through an area lit only by flickering, amber street lamps. That was when the 4 blacked-out SUVs materialized seemingly out of the darkness, their heavy engines emitting a low, synchronized growl that vibrated through the soles of my worn boots. They boxed us in with flawless military precision at a deserted intersection, the heavy armored doors flying open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. Panic seized my throat like a vice. I grabbed Leo's arm, desperately pulling him toward a narrow alleyway, my mind screaming about armed muggers. But Leo didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He stopped dead in the center of the cracked asphalt, gently peeling my trembling fingers off his jacket. "Maya," he commanded, and his voice was completely unrecognizable. It was incredibly deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. It was the voice of a king. "Stand behind me. Do not move a muscle." Men in flawlessly tailored black suits poured from the SUVs, but they didn't draw weapons. Instead, they quickly formed a perfect, silent, and highly disciplined perimeter around us, completely cutting off any avenue of escape. From the lead SUV stepped an older man with silver hair and a jagged scar running down his sharp jawline. He didn't look like a common street thug. He looked like a corporate executioner, a man who coldly calculated human lives on a balance sheet. He stopped exactly 3 paces from Leo and bowed, a sharp, precise dip of the waist that communicated absolute, unquestionable submission. "Young master," the silver-haired man said, his voice echoing loudly in the empty, silent street. "The Patriarch's medical condition has suddenly worsened. The rival factions are already moving their pieces. Your continued absence is no longer an acceptable variable." I stared at Leo, my breath crystallizing in the cold air, waiting for him to laugh, to tell them they had the wrong person, to explain this away as an elaborate, cruel prank. Instead, Leo straightened his posture. The familiar, comforting slouch of the tired art student vanished entirely. He seemed to physically grow taller, broader, his dark aura expanding to violently fill the street. He looked at the silver-haired man, whom he later identified as Silas, not with confusion, but with a weary, incredibly heavy resignation. "I explicitly told my father I needed 1 more year, Silas," Leo said, his tone dripping with an icy authority that made my blood run entirely cold. "Time is a luxury the Dragon Head Syndicate no longer possesses," Silas replied flatly, his eyes flicking briefly, dismissively, to me. Before I could even process the magnitude of his confession, Silas gestured to the open door of the lead SUV. It wasn't an invitation, it was a mandate. My thrift store life was effectively over, entirely incinerated in the span of 3 minutes by the sudden, suffocating reality of the criminal underworld. Within a single hour, my entire reality was violently and permanently rewritten. I was bundled securely into the cavernous back seat of the luxury SUV, the plush leather smelling sharply of exorbitant wealth and old secrets, while the gritty, familiar skyline of my city blurred past the heavily tinted, bulletproof windows. We didn't drive to a seedy underground hideout. We drove to a sprawling, monumental estate perched precariously on the edge of the city's northern cliffs. It was a literal fortress constructed of reinforced glass and brutalist black stone, completely hidden from the world behind towering wrought iron gates and a massive perimeter heavily patrolled by armed guards. The swift transition was sickeningly violent in its sheer opulence. I was immediately ushered into a private guest suite that was significantly larger than my entire neighborhood block. It was an echoing cavern filled with imported silk tapestries, cold Italian marble, and an oppressive, terrifying silence. Leo quickly disappeared into the shadowy depths of the massive estate, leaving me solely in the capable, invisible hands of silent, highly efficient staff who quietly provided me with designer clothes that cost more than a year of my college tuition. When I finally saw him again, it was late in the evening inside a massive, dimly lit dining hall. He was dressed flawlessly in a bespoke dark suit, a heavy silver pin shaped like a coiled dragon resting prominently on his left lapel. He looked magnificent, utterly terrifying, and entirely unreachable. He explained everything across a polished mahogany table long enough to comfortably host a medieval banquet. His real name wasn't Leo, it was Leonidas Thorne. His family, operating under the ancient moniker of the Dragon Head, completely controlled the eastern seaboard's lucrative underground, the massive shipping ports, the labor unions, the complex logistics networks, and a myriad of darker things he flatly refused to name. He was the sole, undisputed heir, violently groomed from birth to eventually take over the vast empire. The art school, the crushing poverty, our quiet life together, it was merely a sanctioned gap period. It was a fleeting, temporary moment of ordinary human existence reluctantly allowed by his ruthless father before Leo was permanently chained to the bloody throne. I desperately wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for absolutely nothing, Leo said softly, his dark eyes pleading with me across the vast expanse of the table. Not for my family's bloody money, not out of sheer terror, not for the immense power I wield. Just for me. You gave me that, Maya. You gave me the only honest thing I've ever had. But his gilded world felt exactly like a suffocating golden cage. The exquisite, chef-prepared food tasted like dry ash in my mouth, and the 1,000-thread-count silk sheets felt remarkably like a funeral shroud. I was fundamentally trapped in a dangerous world built entirely on whispers, lethal leverage, and dark shadows. I had fallen deeply in love with a broke college student, but I had been abruptly kidnapped by the captive king of a dark, unforgiving empire. The following grueling weeks served as a brutal, exhausting masterclass in profound psychological whiplash. By day, I was treated with the terrifying, absolute deference of royalty. I was given unrestricted access to expansive, multi-level libraries, manicured botanical gardens, and every conceivable luxury the Thorne fortune could legally or illegally acquire. By night, however, I witnessed firsthand the horrific, compounding toll the criminal underworld constantly extracted from Leo. The sprawling estate was a restless, high-anxiety hive of quiet, lethal activity. Hard-faced lieutenants constantly came and went at all hours, bringing encrypted ledgers, urgent whispered secrets of rival movements, and sometimes the undeniable metallic scent of fresh blood on their bruised knuckles. Leo was violently thrust into the chaotic, spinning center of a rapidly brewing civil war. His father, the legendary and terrifying current Patriarch, was actively dying in the medical wing, and the rival syndicates, immediately smelling fresh blood in the water, were aggressively testing the boundaries of the Dragonhead's vast territory. More dangerously, highly ambitious internal factions within their own ranks were quietly questioning Leo's fitness to rule. They viewed his years playing the soft, starving artist not as a strategic, sanctioned education in human nature, but as a fatal, unpardonable weakness. I watched him sit quietly in his cavernous study late at night, the soft, amber glow of a brass desk lamp heavily illuminating the deep, hollow exhaustion permanently etched into his aristocratic features. The gentle, charcoal-stained hands that used to hold mine while we watched cheap movies were now casually signing execution orders and complex logistical directives that actively destroyed entire lives. He tried desperately to keep me safely insulated from the creeping violence, attempting to build an invisible, impermeable wall between his bloody daily obligations and the private quarters we shared. But the darkness always seeped inevitably under the heavy oak doors. I saw the dangerous way his jaw violently clenched when his seasoned lieutenants reported a tactical failure on the docks. I felt the rigid, coiled tension radiating from his body when he returned to our suite just before dawn, smelling heavily of expensive cigar smoke, ozone, and coppery, unfiltered fear. He was carrying the crushing, monumental weight of a violent, multi-generational dynasty on his shoulders, desperately trying to maintain his fragile humanity while the Syndicate actively demanded a heartless demon. The internal pressure was mounting exponentially, and the fragile piece of the sprawling estate was merely a powder keg waiting for a single, catastrophic spark. Before we reveal how the shadows finally close in on Leo and Maya, we want to hear from you. We are building a global community here at Blood and Roses Chronicles, and we want to know exactly where in the world you are witnessing this justice unfold. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories of integrity reach. While you're down there, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button to join the fold. And if you know someone who needs to see that even in the shadows, someone is always watching, share this story with them. Your support is the fuel that keeps these chronicles alive. Now, back to the shadows. The inevitable, catastrophic collision occurred when Leo's father finally summoned me to his heavily guarded private chambers. The Patriarch's isolated wing of the massive estate felt exactly like a high-tech mausoleum. It was uncomfortably cold, smelling sharply of sterile antiseptics, humming medical machinery, and decaying old power. He was a withered, fragile man entirely swallowed up by a vast, incredibly ornate bed, hooked up to a dozen flashing monitors that actively tracked his fading life force. But his deeply sunken eyes, which were exact, chilling replicas of Leo's, still burned with a terrifying, unquenchable, and deeply malicious fire. He didn't bother to greet me. He simply laid his heavy, judgmental gaze upon me, ruthlessly assessing my worth and peeling back my layers with a single, contemptuous glare. A common diner waitress, the Patriarch rasped, his voice a dry, agonizing rattle deep in his failing chest. My sole heir chooses to officially rule a multi-billion-dollar criminal empire, and he insists on bringing home a helpless, uneducated stray from the gutter to sit beside him. I stubbornly stood my ground at the foot of his hospital bed, digging my fingernails so deeply into my palms that they actively threatened to draw blood, solely to keep my hands from visibly shaking. I loved the man who willingly lived in the gutter with me, I replied boldly, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady and devoid of the sheer terror I felt. The man who rules your empire is a complete stranger to me. The old man laughed, a harsh, violent, scraping sound that instantly triggered a wet, racking coughing fit. He is no stranger to the dark, girl. You just witnessed his little vacation. This, he gestured weakly with a trembling finger, encompassing the sprawling, fortified estate and everything it represented, is his true blood. You are a massive, unacceptable liability. A fatal softness he absolutely cannot afford if he wishes to survive the coming months. When I am finally gone, the wolves will immediately tear him apart, and they will start by using you as leverage. With a trembling, skeletal hand, he pushed a pre-signed cashier's check across the metallic bedside table. He coldly offered me a staggering, incomprehensible sum of money, enough to disappear completely, to pay off my tuition 10 times over, to buy an entirely new life far away from the Dragon Head. It was a vicious psychological test, and we both instinctively knew it. I looked down at the check, at the zeros that represented absolute freedom, and then back at the dying king of the underworld. I turned on my heel and confidently walked out of the sterile room, leaving his blood money untouched on the silver tray by the heavy oak door. As I successfully navigated the long, echoing corridors back to our suite, the crushing weight of my decision settled over me. I had firmly made my choice. The Patriarch's grim, deathbed warning proved prophetic significantly faster than either Leo or I could have ever anticipated. The old man passed away quietly in the dead of the night, his complex heart monitor finally flatlining with a long, piercing wail that sharply echoed through the desolate West Wing. By sunrise, the entire estate was abruptly placed on strict, military-grade lockdown. The mandatory mourning period was a fragile, highly transparent facade. Beneath the tailored black funeral suits and solemn, deeply bowed faces, a violent, meticulously calculated coup was already in relentless motion. It was Silas, the fiercely loyal, silver-haired lieutenant who had originally pulled us from the freezing alleyway, who orchestrated the massive, sprawling betrayal. He had quietly and efficiently rallied the old guard, the seasoned, battle-hardened men who fundamentally believed Leo was far too soft, too civilized, and completely compromised by his time among the commoners to successfully hold the volatile Dragon Head together. They struck precisely during the formal, highly secure reading of the will. The massive, reinforced oak doors of the executive boardroom were heavily barricaded and securely locked from the outside. Silas stood confidently at the head of the long mahogany table, heavily flanked by a dozen heavily armed, disloyal enforcers. With a chilling, highly practiced calm, he informed Leo that the Syndicate was forcibly transitioning to a new, aggressive management structure, one that strictly did not include a fragile heir. I was physically present in the room, standing quietly and completely ignored against the back wall, practically invisible to men who solely respected immediate violence, vast wealth, and brute force. They entirely dismissed my presence, focusing their predatory attention entirely on Leo. I carefully watched as Leo completely absorbed the devastating magnitude of the betrayal. He didn't shout in anger, nor did he beg for his life. He simply sat back comfortably in his high-backed leather chair, deliberately steepled his long fingers, and looked at Silas with a chilling, absolute calm that perfectly mirrored his late father. "You severely miscalculated the board, Silas," Leo said quietly, his voice cutting clearly through the thick tension of the room like a sharp razor blade. "You foolishly mistook my deep desire for peace as a fundamental inability to wage war." But the room was overwhelmingly heavily armed, the exits were blocked, and Silas simply smiled a broad, arrogant winner's smile. The heavily armed enforcers simultaneously raised their tactical weapons, the synchronized clicking of safeties disengaging sounding exactly like a death knell. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating and heavy with the metallic tang of impending bloodshed. Leo's dark eyes flicked rapidly, actively assessing the tactical angles, but the math was brutally clear. He was heavily outnumbered, outgunned, and entirely trapped in a box of his own making. Silas took a deliberate step forward, raising his own heavy sidearm to personally deliver the killing blow. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. But they had forgotten one crucial, fatal detail. What Silas and his heavily armed conspirators completely failed to realize was that I wasn't just a terrified, helpless diner waitress. I was a girl who had survived the absolute roughest, most unforgiving neighborhoods in the sprawling city. I knew intimately how to observe a hostile room, how to aggressively hustle for survival, and exactly how to spot a fatal structural weakness in a seemingly invincible system. During my suffocating weeks trapped in the opulent golden cage, I hadn't just been passively reading romance novels in the Grand Library. I had been meticulously watching the security staff, actively learning the estate's complex protocol rotations, and taking detailed mental notes of the digital infrastructure that ran the Syndicate's vast empire. Hours before the hostile meeting, acting on a deeply ingrained instinct of street paranoia, I had noticed a subtle anomaly in the internal security feeds. A recurring digital blind spot that the old guard habitually used to move completely unrecorded through the corridors. Using a highly encrypted tablet I had quietly lifted from a careless, sleep-deprived guard the night before, I had carefully tapped into the estate's central environmental controls. As Silas raised his heavy weapon to brutally execute Leo, his finger tightening visibly on the trigger, I stepped quickly out of the shadows and hit a massive, pre-programmed system override command on the stolen tablet. The results were absolutely instantaneous and catastrophic for the armed mutineers. The heavy, motorized blackout curtains of the boardroom violently and loudly retracted, abruptly flooding the dark room with blinding, high-intensity morning sunlight that momentarily blinded the night-adjusted enforcers. Simultaneously, the emergency fire suppression system violently activated. It screamed with deafening, ear-piercing alarms while blasting thick, highly disorienting chemical foam from the ceiling vents directly onto the heavily armed men. Absolute, screaming chaos erupted within the securely locked room. Hardened enforcers shouted in blind panic, rapidly dropping their heavy weapons as they were blinded and sent slipping violently across the slick marble floor. In the midst of the total confusion, Leo moved with terrifying, preternatural speed. He didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He crossed the expansive room in a rapid blur, completely disarming Silas in two brutal, highly efficient, and bone-breaking motions, securely pinning the traitor to the slick mahogany table with his own weapon pressed firmly against his skull. Silas lay pinned, gasping desperately for air, his arrogant smile permanently replaced by absolute, wide-eyed terror. By the time the thick chemical foam finally began to clear and the heavily armed backup guards violently breached the room, the bloody coup was officially over. The broke college student survived solely because the girl from the gutter broke the system. The violent aftermath of the spectacularly failed coup was incredibly swift, highly methodical, and absolutely merciless. Silas and his entire network of heavily armed conspirators were immediately and violently purged from the ranks of the powerful Syndicate. However, Leo didn't actually execute them, a deeply calculated decision that profoundly shocked the remaining, bloodthirsty lieutenants. Instead, he systematically exiled them, completely stripping them of all their hidden wealth, their offshore accounts, and their vast criminal influence. He dumped them unceremoniously back into the very unforgiving streets they had once brutally ruled, actively leaving them to survive as absolute nobodies. It was a masterful, chilling political move that decisively proved he could be utterly ruthless without devolving into a mindless monster. That night, the sprawling estate was finally quiet again, the heavy scent of chemical foam entirely replaced by the sharp, crisp air of the northern cliffs. Leo stood completely alone by the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of his private office, overlooking the glittering, sprawling city below. The heavy silver dragon pin gleamed menacingly on the lapel of his perfectly tailored suit. He was now officially and undisputed the head of the entire Syndicate. The bloody transition of power was finally complete, and the immense weight of the crown was firmly settled upon his broad shoulders. I walked softly up behind him, wrapping my arms tightly around his waist, resting my cheek directly against the rough fabric of his jacket. He leaned back heavily into my embrace, letting out a long, shuddering, and deeply exhausted breath that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 dark secrets. "I honestly thought I lost you in that locked room," he whispered softly, his voice cracking slightly as he stared out at the infinite expanse of city lights, the vast territory he now commanded with an iron fist. "You can't ever lose someone who intimately knows how to successfully navigate the dark," I replied quietly, squeezing him noticeably tighter. We stood there perfectly together in the heavy silence, two profoundly different halves of a newly forged whole. He turned around to face me, placing his hands gently on either side of my face. The cold, calculating apex predator who had violently crushed a rebellion hours ago was completely gone, replaced briefly by the sweet boy who had smiled at me over a shared textbook. "We successfully rule this together," he solemnly promised, his voice a low vow that resonated powerfully in the quiet room. "You are my ultimate balance, Maya. My only truth." I nodded, fully accepting the heavy mantle of the underworld queen. The deepest, most dangerous shadows are undeniably seductive. They consistently promise absolute power, limitless wealth, and an impenetrable, heavily armed sanctuary from the exhausting, daily struggles of ordinary human life. But willingly stepping into the absolute dark requires an unshakable, profoundly strong anchor, lest you inevitably become the exact kind of monster that actively hides within it. Maya genuinely thought she was fiercely protecting a fragile, starving artist from a cruel city, but in harsh reality, she was the exact stabilizing force capable of keeping a terrifying king fundamentally grounded in his own fragile humanity. The true, undeniable power in this gritty story didn't actually lie in the heavy tactical weaponry, the offshore billions, or the blood-soaked title of the Dragon Head. It lay entirely in Maya's unshakable, street-hardened perception. She saw the deeply flawed man long before she ever saw the heavy crown. When the sprawling, unforgiving empire aggressively tried to strip away his humanity and execute him, she utilized her gritty resilience, her sharp observation, and her street-earned survival instincts to violently tilt the scales of power. Justice and survival in the criminal underworld aren't merely about maintaining innocence. It's strictly about maintaining an uncompromising balance. This narrative actively strips away the romanticized veneer of power to explicitly expose the raw, mechanical necessity of partnership. The Dragon Head Syndicate, with all its deep-rooted traditions and highly trained enforcers, severely underestimated the sheer tactical advantage of a partner who fundamentally understands the mechanics of poverty and survival. Maya wasn't blinded by the opulent, suffocating gold of the estate because she knew exactly what it felt like to freeze in a drafty apartment. That grounded perspective became her ultimate armor. She teaches us that true strength isn't always measured in calibers or bank accounts. Sometimes, it is successfully measured in the quiet, calculated ability to see the invisible flaws in a system that everyone else believes is completely invincible. Leo urgently needed a queen who wasn't afraid of the dark, and Maya decisively proved that those who meticulously build themselves from the ground up can never be easily toppled by those who merely inherit the sky. If that final glimpse of Maya standing tall and unyielding beside the throne sent a chill down your spine, then click that like button right now. Subscribe to Blood and Roses Chronicles to join our community for more cinematic journeys into the shadows. Drop a comment below and let's talk about that hard-earned justice. Remember, the world might see someone silent or broken when they look at you today, but never forget, you hold a signal that can change everything. See you on the next one.